Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Meliora podcast with the Sustainability and Resilience Institute at the University of Southampton. This is a podcast where we explore the challenges of sustainability through the work being conducted by our academics, students and alumni in Southampton and other universities. I'm Simon Kemp, Professor of Sustainability Education and Deputy Director of the Sustainability and Resilience Institute at the university. And today we are going to be exploring the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We're having this episode quite early on in the podcast series because we feel that it underpins everything that we discuss through the podcast seasons, and we want to make sure that everybody has really got that overview and insight into what the Sustainable Development Goals are. And joining me for this, we have the two brilliant people who are normally on the other side of the podcast process doing the episodes, but I'm fortunate enough to be working with two fantastic student interns who are very much the podcast team, and they are going to be telling us about the SDGs today. We're going to be looking at some specific examples. I'm now going to ask them to introduce themselves and say a little bit about who you are, and then we'll then get into the conversation around the SDGs. Who would like to go first?
Hi, I'm Lily. I'm an environmental science student just about to go my third year at Southampton.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm a geography student, also just about to go into my third year at Southampton as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So this episode is all about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainability only really started entering the political lexicon in around the mid-1980s, where people started recognising, I think very much on the back of the first United Nations conference back in 1972, which was about human impact on the environment, recognising that you can't separate out the environment from people. People misunderstand the term environment without recognising that it is everything that surrounds us and how we interact with it. So it's very much about recognising that the situation that we have within society, the situation we have within politics, within the different economic settings that we have in individual nations, trading blocks, global infrastructure, all of that has an impact not just on how we interact as people, but also in terms of how we interact in terms of the wider impacts and relationships we have with those species that we share the planet with. Very much around flora and fauna as much as anything else. So we have to recognise that sustainability is everything. But that's problematic when you're looking at it from a political progression perspective. You need to think about something that people can engage with and have a set of targets that people can coalesce around. And we had in the 1980s, we had the United Nations work in this area. We had the Brundtland definition of sustainable development that meets the need of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. If I don't get that right, then I need to take a good hard look at myself. That was published in 1987. That then fed into the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development, which was otherwise known as the 1992 Earth Summit that took place in Rio. From there was an acceptance within the political infrastructures and the terminology of that phrase, sustainable development. Lots of work went on from there, and one of the main outputs then led to that recognition that we need to engage the whole of the planet in this field. For the year 2000, when we had the Millennium Development Goals. They were 8 separate goals that were really focused on development practices and profiles and the need to accept that sustainable development must be exactly that. It must be recognising the importance that all nations have the right to development, they have the right to good access to healthcare, transport, energy infrastructure, education, and not try to have any sort of untoward, unintentional suppression of development. So the Millennium Development Goals were very much based on the progression, notably from what we'd broadly term the Global South, but very much around goals around maternal health, for example, reducing prevalence of HIV and other transmittable diseases, access to universal education being just some of them. they were set for 2015. As we approached 2015, we had the 2012 United Nations Conference, and it was no longer called on Environment and Development, it was called United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. That took place again in Rio, and through that process, there was that recognition the MDGs were coming to an end. What should we do for the future? Not having the most dominant economies part of goals for the global community, I think was wrong, really. I think there has to be a shared responsibility here. So the Sustainable Development Goals were first mooted as a point of agreement in the 2012 United Nations Conference, and there was that global acceptance and signing off from all the participants of the 2012 summit that we were going to set some Sustainable Development Goals. Through a number of years of negotiation, they were eventually published in 2015, and they're called the Global Goals for Sustainable Development, with the target of achieving a set number of broadly ambitious goals and underlying targets by the year 2030. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 169 targets that sit underneath them. I'm now going to see whether I slip up at all, but those 17 SDGs are SDG 1, no poverty. Then we got number 2, which is to eliminate hunger, so it's called zero hunger. Then 3 is good health and well-being. 4 is quality education. 5 is gender equality. 6 is access to clean water and sanitation. 7 is access to clean, affordable energy for all. 8 is decent work and economic growth. 9 is innovation and infrastructure, really about growing the economy in an imaginative and socially and environmentally responsible way. 10 is reduced inequalities. Number 11 is sustainable cities and communities. 12 is responsible consumption and production. 13 is climate action. 14 is life in water, otherwise known as life below water. 15, life on land. 16 is about peace and justice and global infrastructure around the accessibility of regulation. And then number 17 is otherwise known as the all-encompassing goal, partnership for the goals. I don't believe I slipped up anywhere there, did I? No. People looking, shaking their head, saying, no, that was all fine. Good. I was relatively happy with that. Those goals, they do come across as being very ambitious. But when you think of the complexity of the sustainability problem, when you think of the challenges that we've got as a global community, they need to be ambitious. Some people criticise them for being, well, you're never going to eliminate poverty. Well, even if we don't eliminate poverty entirely, if we get close to that, then that's great. Same with zero hunger. You might not have a situation where everybody's not going to go hungry. But if most people, the vast majority of the world's population, are not being hungry, then we've made significant and important progress. Same with clean water and sanitation. You know, you're looking at over 2 billion people globally not having access to reliable and safe clean water and sanitation on a daily basis. That can't be right. If we start tackling that and we get close to eliminating it, fantastic. So yes, they are ambitious, but they are underpinned by a number of challenging targets for the global community. It's worth talking about this now because as we speak, we are pretty much halfway through those SDGs. We're here in July 2023, and we've got another 7 years to go until we get to that point of delivery of 2030. There undoubtedly will be new goals to be set at that point in time, and we'll have a conversation about those towards the end. But I think that an important thing to recognise is that each of the SDGs are interrelated. They can't be tackled in isolation, but at the same time, they need to be tackled in depth because that's the only way you're going to achieve progress. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about some of those Sustainable Development Goals, just so you can go into them in a little bit more detail and understand what they're trying to achieve and some of the work that's gone on to date by looking at a case study example. So Lily, would you be able to kick us off by talking about SDG 14, please?
Yeah, of course. So this SDG is life in water, which involves conserving and sustainably using the oceans, seas and marine resources for sustainable development. So this involves sustainably managing and protecting marine and coastal ecosystems from pollution and address the impacts of ocean acidification. This SDG is really important because over 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. An example that I looked at was the United Arab Emirates. So this is a pretty big goal for them at the moment. So they're known for being really involved with oil, but they're becoming increasingly invested in ecotourism, and they've got so many marine ecosystems that are involved in that, such as mangroves, and they're slowly being protected by environmental law. So despite being so focused on improving this, they've got quite a lot of challenges with addressing this SDG. One of the big problems with this is sea pollution. So their oil industry then obviously pollutes into the ocean. So they've got to tackle that industry in order to tackle ocean pollution. And then the neighbouring countries near them, there's a lot of disagreement with how important this SDG is. So there needs to be better cooperation of tackling ocean pollution for everyone using the same resource. So other countries nearby aren't as fast with pollution. So they're polluting these oceans, which then gets carried to the United Arab Emirates' ocean. Then that's influencing the marine life in there, but that country can't use it as they'd like to. So there needs to be a better policy in terms of that. And there's also a lot of difficulty at the moment because the actual indicators are really difficult to measure. So a lot of the efforts here aren't recognised because there's not proper indicators to show that. So despite having all this area that they've protected, there's no way that that's being acknowledged in terms of the SDGs. So I think it's 14.4.1 and 14.5.1 are the only ones that are appropriately measured for this SDG.
Wow.
Which is obviously a really big problem.
Yeah.
All the work that's been put in towards this isn't being acknowledged. So it's difficult to track how well countries are doing in terms of this SDG.
That is very problematic, isn't it? Because you need to be able to measure progress. You need to be able to say whether the work that has been funded around the SDGs, the way of bringing the international community together, is actually making a meaningful change for the better. So if there's that lack of monitoring, then that is something that many would consider to be a flaw within the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's a point that's worth highlighting within this particular episode. We're not saying for a moment that the SDGs are perfect. They're not. They're important. They're a way that, because of the diversity of the SDGs, you can normally highlight some that people are going to feel personally invested in. Whether that's in the public sense, whether it's something that people believe from a moral perspective, or whether they look at it from a perspective around their workplace or where they're studying, there's something that people can identify with. From an academic perspective, you can talk about the SDGs to any academic and you can always find at least one where they're already working. But if there aren't any meaningful targets sitting behind them, that's difficult to get people to work to. That's difficult to get people to be interested in that. So I think that's a really important point that you raised there, Lily. I think it's something that, as we talk about the future for the SDGs and what might follow from 2030, that need for better monitoring, that need for better, more meaningful data. That was brilliant, thank you. I think one of the points you mentioned there was very much about the pollution that goes into the water, goes into and affects marine life. A lot of that pollution is associated with how we produce goods, how we then consume goods, what mechanisms have we got in place around responsible consumption and production. So, Sophie, you've been looking into SDG 12. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so the main goal of SDG 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. So it's meant to ensure good use of resources, improve energy efficiency and sustainable infrastructure, provide access to basic services, and just ensure a better quality of life. So one aim I read is to do more and better with less. And obviously, as the population continues to grow, the demand for natural resources increases. And I read that if the population reaches the projected 9.6 billion by 2050, we effectively need to have 3 Earths worth of resources to meet that demand with the current way we're living. So it's very important to be sustainable with your consumption and production. The current progress, I think, for all of the SDGs, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a major impact on the consumption and production patterns as well as all the other goals, because it's disrupted supply chains so heavily and also just changed people's consumer behaviour. So a particular case study I like to look at is fast fashion, because we're now in a consumer-driven society with fast fashion coming into play because people buy into it. And it's this toxic production where they create so many new items really cheaply every day. The brand Shein, Shein, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, add 600 new items to their website every single day, which is just, who needs that much option? Like, surely that's overwhelming to have that much option. So it's a way of instilling urgency to people to make them buy. So it's all just for their company to improve their profits, basically. And because of this, people buy the clothes, wear them once, chuck them away, or don't even wear them. So 20% of all clothing purchases are never worn, which is ridiculous. People buy clothes, leave it in their wardrobe, decide that's gone out of fashion, get rid. And every second, a truckload of textiles is buried in landfill or incinerated, and less than 1% of clothes are recycled. So at the moment, we currently have enough clothes for everyone. Like, we wouldn't need to make any more because of the amount that's already been produced. So I think it highlights the importance of recycling, even if it's about creating a more circular economy and like extending that life cycle more. So charity shops, buying less, better quality, it's just all ways that we can help SDG 12.
Fantastic, thank you. I think the link you make there between the consumption patterns and the way that is actually being led by industry is a really important part of the problems that are being faced here.
Yeah.
I think that you can also say that links in with SDG 3 in terms of good health and well-being, where people get that endorphin rush of buying something new, having a new product, and that is then being made so easy for people and so cheap that it just keeps this whole system working, and it keeps a system working that is damaging. It's damaging to people, it's damaging the planet without doubt, and it isn't the circular economy model that you talked about there. The circular economy model about making sure that we are actually maximising resource usage. In terms, when I say resource usage, I mean in terms of any products that we buy, maximising their lifespan and then putting them back into a chain of reuse rather than going down to recycling, incineration, disposal, etc. All of that then is a huge challenge in two different ways. One of those is very much around how we get people to change their behaviour patterns. So I'm reaching out more of late in particular to colleagues within the School of Psychology, looking at behaviour change, because so much of this is, we always say that sustainability is all about people. It's about working with people. It's about getting people on board and getting them to think about what they're doing. But without the infrastructure, then they can't change. And that's part of the problem here. So it's about getting people to take a step back, think, act, but the action can only base on what you're actually doing in the way of the systems that they're working within, where they live. And the notions of reuse, they need to have people connected, need to have people close by, because reuse is great, but if you're reusing and you're sending a single product on a single journey to another part of the country, because the reuse apps are fantastic, don't get me wrong, because when you look at the amount of resources that are utilised in the making of a single garment, some of the figures are eye-watering. So any reuse is great, but equally you don't want to be buying something on one of the reuse softwares. We're not going to promote any on here, obviously, that somebody's sending it from Newcastle, for example, and it's coming down on a road transport. That's not great. So you want to have people more closely connected. So the point you're making there about community swapping, about charity shops, is great, because you've got very little, if any, transport emissions associated with those. Now that all then comes back to how we structure our society and our communities. So SDG 11 is all about sustainable cities and communities. So Lily, would you be able to expand on that goal a little bit more, please?
Yeah, of course. So this involves making cities and human settlements more inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. So it covers housing, transport systems, urbanisation, cultural and natural heritage, natural disasters, environmental impact and greener public spaces. So one example I looked at is Amsterdam, which is classed as a smart city, or trying to go towards being a smart city. So smart cities try to integrate smart technologies. Benefit of this is improving quality of life by focusing on better resource utilisation, governance, resolution of societal issues and reduced environmental emissions. So what Amsterdam have been doing is they're really focusing on getting the population involved. So a lot more of a bottom-up approach in coming up with new ways that they can reduce their emissions and improve all of the things I just mentioned. So they've promoted startups and innovations and offered tax deductions to employees from startups to encourage new companies to grow and then develop any ideas that they have. And also to get to speak to people directly, they've got open house programs to communicate and empower citizens to want to create a change in their city. They've also tried to do an urban energy transition, which was the starting point of the Amsterdam Smart City programme. So this has involved creating new energy solutions in existing buildings, so changing what they've already got there rather than creating something completely new to reduce resource usage. So this has included retrofitting, district heating, and changing the smart grid for energy. So all of these bottom-up approaches, not only have they managed to find loads of new projects and then implement them into their further development, but it's also helped citizens become more aware of smart lifestyles and how they can improve how they live to make their city more sustainable. So I think this is starting to be applied in some other places, but Amsterdam's like the main place that I found that's been doing this.
That's a really inspiring case study, thank you. I think that we need to have these case studies so different political leaders, different countries can understand what can be achieved, what is possible, and what progress has been made elsewhere. But also it needs to get out to community groups as well. So when people are saying we want a more sustainable city, then they understand what it means, and then they can say when they go to talk to their political leaders, look, this is an example of what can be achieved. This is an example of how this has been tackled. Everybody needs examples and inspiration, and I think that's a really fantastic example. I think another example of a city that's working towards a more sustainable infrastructure and way of life is also worth looking at Copenhagen as well. They do some amazing work there. Everybody that I know that's read about Copenhagen has been there. It is a really inspirational case study. And again, I think we need to be able to celebrate those to show that it is possible. Within cities, and it's all about the way that we interact with each other as well. And the way that we interact with each other can be sometimes tied in with how we behave towards others. And SDG 5 is about one of the most important issues, which is gender equality, making sure that everybody has equal access to opportunities, but people are being treated correctly, that there is proper recognition around gender. So, Sophie, would you be able to tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing looking into SDG 5, please?
SDG 5 is achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. So it includes ending all forms of violence, discrimination, recognising and value unpaid work, unpaid care and domestic work, ensuring equal opportunities and participation for leadership at all levels of decision making in political, economic and public life. So obviously it has progressed when you look back. Women work more, they get higher paid jobs, better in education, and actually are more likely to go on to higher education than men currently. But there is no country in the world where women and girls as a group are not disadvantaged in relation to men and boys. So at the current rate, it would take 286 years to close gaps in legal protection and remove discriminatory laws, and 140 years for women to be represented equally in positions of power and leadership in the workplace. So, a case study I like to look at is gender inequality in agriculture, and also effectively the impacts of climate change that is happening, that happens because of that. So because of the existing inequalities and social norms, they contribute so much to climate change vulnerability. So women have different roles, opportunities and interests, and are more vulnerable to climate change than other groups. So a charity I've researched quite a lot called ActionAid do a lot of work in terms of everything for gender equality, but I was particularly looking at gender equality in agriculture. So they work on effectively empowering women and often women already have the knowledge, but they don't have the opportunities. So they know what they need to do, but they don't have the access to technology in the same way that men do in developing countries where women do dominate the agricultural sector. So it's about teaching them and supporting women in how they can do sustainable practices with their farming. So an example was they supported Cambodian women in planting mangroves so they can sustain themselves and their families and secure their livelihoods. So it's something that might seem quite small scale, but actually has a large impact on their lives and does help make people more equal. Different things like intercropping, so having the knowledge to know which crops you should plant where to stop your soil becoming infertile and drying out, obviously helps them paid more because they have more crops, just a better livelihood. So there's so many different examples of little things they can do with their practices to help them, and it's kind of phrased as agroecology. That's the kind of term they use. ActionAid have also done a whole research project called Close the Gap, and they found that women in developing countries could be better off by $9 trillion if their pay and access to paid work were equal to that of men. So the gender pay gap still very much exists. So in the US, women earn 82 cents for every $1 earned by a man, while black women earn 62 cents and Native American women earn 57 cents. So it's important to look at that because obviously it is difficult. Women have more responsibilities, but I think that's something for companies. That's more like an institutional thing, like company policies rather than an individual, because I can't go in and demand better pay. I don't know, that a lot of work needs to be done on that. And I read something called the motherhood penalty, which is actually it's proportional. As you have more children, your pay goes down, which makes sense because you gain more responsibility the more children you have. But
I would challenge that. I don't think it does make more sense. I don't think it's right at all. I understand you don't think it's right as well, obviously. It's one of these economic impacts that sometimes society tries to justify by saying because you've got more children, then you can have you might have more time taken away, but it should never be like that. Yeah. It should always be a shared responsibility. Ideally, I recognise that not all family infrastructures work that way, and there are going to be relationship issues, etc. But ideally, there should be shared responsibility, and ideally, there shouldn't be any type of gender pay gap whatsoever. Yeah. Individual areas of career aspirations, maybe down to an individual level, you can leave that to individuals. But you are right. Society and pay need to be completely restructured. I get a little bit frustrated, well, I get very frustrated actually, when people sometimes talk about this and they're saying, this can't be right in 2023. That's not the issue. It was never right at all, ever. What's the year got to do with it? It's never been right. And I think it's such a critical area because we've got to have equal access to all opportunities and equal recognition for everybody. Looking at it from an entirely selfish perspective, if I'm wanting the world to solve the sustainability challenges, the only way you can do this is by making sure that everybody contributes. And by making sure people feel disenfranchised, you're not going to get everybody contributing. It just cannot happen. So the gender equality is something which I'm not sure whether people frequently ever think of it as a sustainability issue, because sometimes I think people think that sustainability, it gets confused with it's all about the natural environment and saving the pandas and the polar bears. It's not about that. It's about everything that's affected, everything that can be impacted, and everything that can work in terms of what we broadly categorise as a positive future. So I think that gender equality is great that it's there within one of the SDGs, and it's very, very important that it is. And in terms of working forward for the future, you'd certainly want it to still be one of the most important SDGs to focus on. But also I think in terms of the terminology that's used within there needs to be updated, because we live in a very different society now than when the SDGs were originally formulated in terms of recognition about all the broad array of different gender equality issues. And I think that is an important step forward that needs to be taken. But I thought you made some brilliant points there. It's really interesting case studies that you mentioned. One of the case study points that you mentioned there was about how this is all affected by climate change. And people frequently perceive sustainability to be that whole point around it's all wrapped up within climate change. Now, I would certainly think that all of the impacts that we have on each of the different other 16 SDGs are affected by our changing climate, and equally all the progress or lack of progress that we make in all the other 16 SDGs impact on how we tackle climate change. So I think it's a really interesting and important one, and I think that in terms of, whilst recognising that we could talk about all of the different SDGs, we're not going to do so, as we said at the start, but I think it'd be a good wrap-up. One of our more detailed investigations within SDGs would be to talk about SDG 13. So, Lily, would you be able to give us a little bit more detail on that,
so
please?
SDG 13 is climate action, which involves taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And like you said, this one is so connected with every other SDG. And I think the problem at the moment is a lot of developing countries are really prioritising economic growth, and a lot of the time doing that you're sacrificing sustainability because so many people are dependent on fossil fuels. So obviously it's going to be really important to make sure that countries are developing and getting the same opportunities as all the other countries, but not sacrificing the climate as part of that. So a big problem that I identified was transport, because that is at the moment so reliant on fossil fuels. Then big exhaustion of natural resources, despite encouraging involvement in industry